Hey y'all, I'm James Wright. Welcome to my shop. Recently we made this step stool for my wife and it's a lot of fun, but it has angled dovetails and those get really scary. Some people are wondering, how in the world do you do angled, splayed dovetails? Let's dive in. We're gonna have a little bit of fun with this. So the first thing we want to do before we cut the dovetails is figure out the angle of the board. Now, in a normal dovetail, it's going to be 90 degrees, and so you've already cut your angle. Everyone cuts at 90 degrees, but with hand tools, even 90 degrees is an angle. So if you just cut your chamfer to whatever angle you're going to be putting your dovetails at, you're ready to start going. The first problem with cutting an angled dovetail is putting on layout lines. Normally you're going to figure out the thickness of your board and then you're going to put in your depth cut on this. But with the angle on here, if I put it at that angle, it's going to be a different distance from here to there because it's the angle of the board, as well as where do I actually put this bevel gauge. It's not running, right up against the side of this, which would make it very easy. We have to try and figure out how are we going to do it on this. So if it were just 90 degrees, I'd put my board on here and flush it up with the end, and then I can scribe across the line. But in this case, it's an angle, and so that kind of confuses people, but all you have to do is put the board on there, adjust it to that angle, flush it up with the other side, and you can still draw your line across there. So the other thing to do is, because the thickness of the board is what's important, you can actually set your marking gauge up and then just keep it flush on the end of the board and draw your line on with that. So that should end up being exactly the same as if you put your board on there and flushed it up to that mark. And voila, we have our end mark. But the problem is, how do we actually get it on the face of the board? So then for the depth of cut mark, I can't use a marking gauge because it's a slightly different angle, so it's a slightly different width. So this running along there doesn't work well. But because I have the marks on the end of the board, what I can do is put my marking knife into that line, set the square on there, and then I can draw my line straight across the board. Then I can flip the board over, make sure I flip the square so I'm still referencing the same side, do the exact same thing on this side, put my mark into my line, and draw a square line right across there. Now I have my depth of cut line all the way across. And we need to start laying out our dovetails. And some people are going to have very particular ways about laying out their dovetails. I like to have fairly large pins, but do whatever you want. So you can see it's beveled at the angle we've been choosing. Now what we want to do is, once we have these points, we're going to actually draw a line straight across, just like we would with a normal dovetail. Straight across at each of our points, and then we're going to cut down at an angle. Now, whatever angle you want it to be, you can lay out your lines just like that and just like that. I like to eyeball them myself because I like to actually see all my angles being at ever so slightly different angle. I like that aesthetic. It is something that I find appealing, but not everyone does. Once we do that, it's set the saw on the kerf and cut down. We want to make sure we keep it at 90 degrees across the board. Set it at the angle we want. And then we cut down to our depth stop. Now, because it's an angle, I'm keeping this end high so that I can come around to this side and I can check until I am right on that line on both sides. Then I'll move over to the next one and repeat the process again all the way down the board. So as you can see, it's at this point, it's not that much different from a normal dovetail at 90 degrees. You just have to kind of think through it. On the next step, there'll be something that's slightly different, but for right now, we're just going to cut dovetails, so don't be afraid of it. So for the end pins, we can actually cut those off. Rather than keeping the saw at 90 degrees to the plate, we're actually going to use that scribe line that we set up with our bevel gauge earlier, and we're just going to go to that. Remember, cutting at an angle with a handsaw is the exact same whether the angle is 90 degrees or 10 degrees or 45 degrees. You just find a line, and as long as you can cut to that line, you're good. So set it at that, and then follow your depth gauge all the way down the side of the board. Once that's done, come in with a chisel, do the final cleanup, and this pin is cleaned out. So at this point, it's basically like any other tail, except for rather than keeping the chisel vertical this way, we're actually going to lean it over to match that angle. And what that angle is, it really doesn't matter because the only thing you're going to see is right tight on that line. So there's a little bit of undercut in there, no problem at all. So I'm going to stay away from the line a little bit and chop in and then pare out. After we've chopped in, I'll come with the chisel and pop out those pieces. Then chop down again, repeat the process. Remember to keep it at that little bit of an angle, and you're good to go. So now we've cut down about halfway. I want to take it back to that marking gauge line, set the chisel in it, put the chisel at that angle, and I'm going to be looking at it from this angle and kind of eyeballing it with the shoulder I have over here, and then chop in. Repeat the process on down the line, then we can flip over the board and do the other half of it. Okay, so now we've flipped the board over, and it's basically the exact same thing. We're going to stay away from the line a little ways, chop in and pare out, and chop in and pare out. But I want to make sure that I actually change the angle now. I'm cutting back into the board rather than cutting out of the board. So tap it, chop in, and then come in and pare out. You know the drill. And soon you're going to get close to halfway through, and this whole piece will pop out. So here you can see the angle that I'm chopping back at. I'm trying to undercut it just a little bit, so I'm making the angle a little bit farther than it needs to be, and eventually we're just going to pop through like that, and now we have this piece that we can pull out. Now because this is angled, this thing is kind of hard to pull out, but with a little bit of working, you can pull out that nice little chunk. So once we've done that, we need to then go back to this line, put it right into that marking gauge line, go at the angle we need to go, and chop it out. Okay, so now we've cleaned these all out, and you can see I've undercut here. What I want to do is bring in the bevel gauge and actually see where we are. Is anything sticking up? Anything need to be undercut? There's always a few spots that get a little bit picky, and getting a good dovetail chisel allows you to get into those corners. I actually have a video showing how to make this one, if you want to see that. We're going to clean these out, get them ready to then make the pins and fit them. And voila, that is what I'm looking for. Runs all the way across. So now we want to transfer the marks from our tails onto our pin board. And this is kind of tricky. Most of the time you can have it flat and you can draw your lines, but it's at a weird angle. So what I do is basically treat it the exact same. Rather than using a plane right up against the edge, I move the plane farther back over here so I can rest that on there, and I move the plane back and forth until I find the angle that it needs to be at. At that point, we can do the normal thing of putting some pressure on it and marking out our lines. So I'm going to be holding pressure down on the board, making sure it doesn't move around, and I'll come in with a light cut, medium, and a heavy, and I want to make sure I'm not putting so much pressure on it that I move it around. I'm trying to kind of tuck underneath the tail just a little bit, making sure that everything is the way it needs to be. And then after we have those marked, immediately while the board is here, I want to come through and I want to mark out, remove that, remove that, remove that, and remove that. That way I don't have any guesswork later on. So then what I want to do is actually bring in a square here, and I want to make sure that these are square and my cuts are perfectly down, just like with a regular dovetail. And I want to cut this line all the way up along there. And then I want to make sure I stay on the right side of the line. So where's my X? I want to stay on that side of the line. Just starting the cut nicely, get right tight up against it, and then cut right down your line. And just like before, I'm going to check on the other side, make sure that I'm coming up to that line. Some people do like to use a mirror so that they can see the line, but I find it's quick to just bend over and look at it. If you like that, then try a mirror. You might like it. Okay, so we've cut down on each of these. Now we need to remove the waste, making sure we're chopping out the sections that have the X. We're going to do the exact same thing we did with the pins. Stay away from the line, chop in at a slight angle, and then come back and pare out. It's basically same thing you did before, just a little bit more of it. Chop in, pare out. The only thing we want to be careful of is to match the angle that we cut earlier. We don't want to be chopping straight down. We want to relax the chisel back to match that angle. Chop in, pare out. You should know this story by now. So once we've chopped through on this side and we brought it back to the line, then we can flip it over. Make sure you clean off the space. You don't want to be crushing this down into that. And then second verse, same as the first. Attach this side. And we can keep chopping down. Just remember at this time, we're not angling the chisel back this way, we're angling it this way. So stay away from the line and continue on. Also make sure you're chopping out the right section, not the pins. Leave them alone. Okay, we now have pins and we have tails, and we cut them with a saw and we can see how they fit. Now, if my name was Frank Klaus, these would go together perfectly, but my name is not Frank Klaus, and so every time you do it, they're going to need a little bit of fiddling until you've spent years and years of doing it. So let's put them on there, just give them a couple taps down and see how they go. So what we're looking for, any spots where it rubs. So I'm just going to lightly tap it in. I'm using a soft face leather mallet here. And you can hear the tone. Here it's a little springy. Here it's a little springy. Here it's a harder tone. And I don't know if you can pick that up, but I can feel a deeper, heavier tone. So that means that it's tighter here. And if I look inside, sure enough, inside this gap, it's really darn tight, and I can see it's kind of pinching up. Good here, a little bit pinching up here. Good here, good here, good here. So I'm a little tight in this corner. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark where it's tight. It's tight right here, and it's tight right here. I'm going to pull this apart and clean up those joints a little bit. Okay, so I marked on here which sides were tight, and so I need to clean this up just a hair. Come here and just shave off, not much at all, just like a few thousandths, maybe a 1/100th of an inch. Nothing major, just a little bit here, all the way down nice and flat. Once I get that in, I'm going to come in and just smooth it out, and then chop this out, and we can try it again. So we can bring this back in, give it another tap. And that makes mouths happy. That is exactly what I am looking for. So that's about ready for glue up. Nice and tight. A little bit of a gap here that my saw was cut off, but oh well. Everything else is looking pretty darn nice. Once we glue that up, we'll be able to plane this off nice and smooth, and you won't be able to see much of anything on there. Very, very happy with how that came out. So there you have it. A splayed dovetail really is just a normal dovetail to someone with hand tools. If you can see a line, you can cut to it, and you've got that. It's really not that much more difficult than a standard 90-degree dovetail. Whereas with power tools, it suddenly becomes a lot more interesting. With hand tools, it's not that much more. So I hope you like this. If you have any questions or ideas, let me know down in the comments below. I'd love to hear those. And as always, I do want to say a huge thank you to the patrons on Patreon and those who buy t-shirts and card scrapers on my website. That really does mean a lot, and it helps make this channel better than it is today. So if you do like the channel, please let me know. And until next time, have a wonderful day.